Understand this. When you're dealing with an avoidant personality, your instinct will betray you. Everything in you will want to move closer when they move away. You'll want to clarify, to fix, to reconnect, to restore the emotional equilibrium as quickly as possible. But the very act of chasing no matter how well intended registers in their psychology as pressure. And pressure to an avoidant feels like a loss of autonomy. The moment they feel that loss, they don't lean in, they shut down. So the game changes. Respecting their need for space is not about passivity, it's about precision. It's a strategic emotional posture rooted in self-respect. When you say, I respect your space, but I also value consistency, you are doing something very few people know how to do. You are holding two truths at the same time. You are not abandoning yourself to accommodate them, and you are not suffocating them to soothe your own anxiety. You are standing in the middle ground, centered and in control. Now, let's go deeper. Avoidants are not indifferent people. That's the illusion. What they actually are is internally overwhelmed. Intimacy triggers a subconscious fear of dependency, of losing control, of being engulfed. So when things get emotionally close, their system activates distance as a form of self-protection. If you respond to that distance with intensity, urgency, or emotional escalation, you confirm their fear. You become, in their mind, the very thing they're trying to escape. But when you respond with calm understanding without collapsing your own standards, you disrupt that pattern. You become psychologically safe, but not easily taken for granted. And that combination is rare. Think about the message you send when you don't chase. You're saying, without saying it, I choose connection, but I don't depend on it for my stability. That's power. That's emotional sovereignty. And an avoidant, whether they admit it or not, respects that. Because on a deep level, they're wired to maintain control. And when they meet someone who already has control over themselves, the dynamic shifts. But here's where most people get it wrong. They confuse giving space with silent suffering. They step back physically, but internally they're anxious, overthinking, waiting, hoping. That energy leaks out in delayed texts and passive-aggressive comments and subtle emotional pressure, and the avoidant feels it. They always feel it. True respect for their space is clean. It's not loaded with expectation. It's not a tactic to get a reaction. It's a reflection of who you are. You are someone who does not chase clarity, you invite it. You don't demand presence, you require it through your standards. And when you embody that consistently, something interesting happens. The avoidant begins to feel less threatened by closeness because closeness no longer feels like a trap. It feels like a choice. And when they come backhand, they will. In their own time, they come back with a different perception of you. Not as someone they can drift away from without consequence, but as someone whose presence is steady, whose absence is felt, and whose respect must be earned. So you don't force them to stay. You don't force them to engage. You simply become the kind of person whose energy cannot be disrespected without losing access to it. Because at the end of the day, the moment you stop chasing is the moment they start reconsidering your value. Now, once you've mastered the ability to give space without losing yourself, you can move on to more challenging tasks. The next step is where most people either gain respect or quietly lose it. That is your ability to set boundaries without emotional overload. Because here's the truth. An avoidant doesn't fear boundaries. They fear intensity. They fear emotional chaos, unpredictability, and the feeling of being pulled into something they can't control. So when you come at them with long explanations, emotional flooding, or reactive energy, they don't hear your boundary, they experience your emotion. And the moment they feel that intensity rise, their instinct is not to cooperate, it's to withdraw. So the question becomes, can you communicate a standard without turning it into a storm? This is where precision matters. Instead of saying, why do you always ignore me? This isn't fair. I deserve better. You're hurting me, which may be valid emotionally, but overwhelming psychologically. You shift to something grounded and controlled. I'm okay giving space, but I won't accept being ignored. Notice the difference. One is emotionally charged and invites defensiveness. The other is calm, direct, and immovable. It doesn't attack. It doesn't beg. It simply defines reality. And that's what a boundary really is. It's not a demand for someone else to change. It's a declaration of what you will and will not participate in. Avoidants, on a deeper level, actually respect this more than you might think. Why? Because clarity reduces pressure. When they know exactly where you stand without having to decode emotional signals, they feel less trapped. Ironically, the clearer and calmer you are, the less they feel the need to escape. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. Your boundary only works if it's emotionally neutral. The moment you attach emotional urgency to it, hoping they'll finally get it or change, you've shifted from self-respect to negotiation. And avoidants are highly attuned to that shift. They may not articulate it, but they feel when your boundary is a disguised plea for reassurance. So the discipline is this: say less, mean more. You don't need a speech. You don't need to convince them. You simply state your position and allow your behavior to reinforce it. If they cross the line, you don't escalate, you adjust your availability. You don't argue, create distance. Not as punishment, but as alignment. Because the strongest boundary is not spoken, it's demonstrated. And when you do this consistently, something shifts in the dynamic. You're no longer someone they can test endlessly. You're no longer someone who reacts in predictable emotional patterns. You become stable, grounded, and most importantly, self-governing. That's what commands respect. Now, does this mean they'll immediately change? Number. Avoidants move at their own pace. But what has changed immediately is how they perceive you. You're no longer an emotional variable in their life, you're a constant. And people treat constants differently. They don't push them as far. They don't take them as lightly. And more importantly, you begin to feel different within yourself. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can express your needs without losing control of your state. You're no longer walking on eggshells, and you're no longer over-explaining your worth. You're simply living it. Because in the end, respect is not something you extract through emotion, it's something you establish through clarity. And the moment your words become calm, clear, and non-negotiable is the moment they start taking you seriously. Now, once you've established space without losing yourself, and you've learned to communicate boundaries with clarity instead of emotional overload, everything begins to hinge on a deeper, more subtle principle where your words are actually coming from. Because people don't just respond to what you say. They respond to the state you're in when you say it. And this is where most people unintentionally give away their power. They speak from a fear of loss. You can hear it in the tone, even if the words sound strong. There's an underlying energy that says, I hope this doesn't push you away, or I need this to work. And an avoidant who is already sensitive to pressure and expectation picks up on that instantly. So even when you're trying to set a boundary, if it's rooted in fear, it doesn't land as strength, it lands as attachment. Now here's the shift. You have to move from needing the connection to choosing it. There's a fundamental difference between those two states. When you need something, your identity becomes entangled with the outcome. Your emotional stability becomes dependent on their response, their presence, their consistency. And that dependency creates subtle behaviors, over explaining, over accommodating, tolerating things you normally wouldn't, because at some level, you're trying to preserve the connection at all costs. But when you choose something, you're grounded in yourself first. The connection becomes an extension of your life, not the center of it. And that changes everything about how you communicate. When you say, I want this, but I don't need it to feel complete, you're not playing a game. You're expressing a psychological truth. Your sense of self is intact, with or without them. And that's what commands respect. Because think about it, an avoidant is constantly trying to maintain emotional independence. So when they encounter someone who is already independent, who isn't trying to merge, control, or cling, it disarms their defenses. There's nothing to push against. There's no pressure to escape from. Instead, there's space. And within that space, something unexpected happens. They begin to lean in, not because they're being pulled, but because they're not being pushed. Now, this doesn't mean you become detached or indifferent. That's a misunderstanding. It means your attachment is clean. You care, but you're not consumed. You're invested, but you're not dependent. There's a quiet confidence in that state. You're no longer asking, how do I keep this person? You're asking, does this connection align with who I am? And that question alone shifts the entire dynamic, because now you're evaluating, not chasing. Avoidants, whether consciously or not, respect people who have that internal standard, because they themselves operate from a place of self-protection and control. When they see someone who is self-contained, who isn't trying to take that control away from them, they feel safer engaging. But here's the key. This only works if it's real. You can't fake self-worth with words alone. You can't say, I don't need this, while internally feeling like you do. That contradiction creates tension. And again, they'll sense it. Your behavior will eventually reveal the truth. So the work is internal. It's about building a life, a mindset, and an identity that doesn't hinge on one person's presence. It's about knowing that you bring value into any connection, not because someone validates it, but because you've already defined it. And when you speak from that place, your words carry weight. There's no urgency behind them, no hidden agenda, just clarity. I want this, but I don't need it. That's not rejection. That's freedom. And the paradox is, the less you need someone to stay, the more they begin to feel the significance of being in your life. Because in the end, respect doesn't come from how tightly you hold on, it comes from how whole you are without holding on at all. Once you've grounded yourself in self-worth and you're no longer speaking from fear, the next shift becomes unavoidable, because now it's not just about what you say, it's about what you allow to continue. And this is where the dynamic either transforms or quietly stays the same. Because here's the hard truth. People don't just respond to your words, they respond to what your behavior rewards. If someone can be inconsistent, dismissive, or disrespectful, then they are not a good fit for the role, and still have full access to you, your time, your attention, your energy. Then, on a psychological level, that behavior gets reinforced. Not consciously, not maliciously, but through repetition. The mind learns, this works, this has no cost. Avoidants, in particular, operate heavily through this pattern recognition. They test distance, they pull back, they re-engage, and if every cycle ends with you being available in the same way, nothing compels them to recalibrate. Not because they don't care, but because the system between you hasn't required change. So when we talk about removing the reward for disrespect, we're not talking about punishment. That's where people get it twisted. Punishment is emotional, reactive, and often driven by the desire to make the other person feel what you felt. That backfires with an avoidant because it creates more emotional intensity, and intensity is exactly what they withdraw from. This is something different. This is consequence. Calm, measured, self-directed consequence. When you say, if this continues, I'll step back, the power isn't in the sentence, it's in the certainty behind it. There's no anger, no escalation, no attempt to control them. You're simply defining the terms under which you participate. You're saying, access to me is not unconditional, it's aligned with how I'm treated. And then comes the part most people struggle with, following through. Because the moment arrives where they repeat the behavior, maybe they disappear again. Maybe they dismiss your concern, and now you're faced with a decision. Do you stay consistent with your standard, or do you bend it to preserve the connection? This is the moment that defines everything. If you bend even slightly, the message is clear. Your boundary was flexible. And once something is perceived as flexible, it will be tested again. Not out of disrespect, but because human behavior always moves toward what is permitted. But when you follow through quietly, without drama, you create a different kind of impact. You don't argue. You don't explain repeatedly. You simply reduce your availability. You shift your energy. You stop over-investing. And suddenly, there's a gap. That gap is where awareness begins. Because for the first time, their behavior produces a different outcome. The pattern is interrupted. And in that interruption, they're forced consciously or unconsciously to reassess. Something changed. Access is no longer guaranteed. That's when respect starts to form, not from what you said, but from what you did. Now, does this mean they'll immediately rise to the occasion? Not always. Some will test further. Some will retreat. But regardless of their reaction, something crucial has already happened. You've shifted your own standard. You stop participating in a dynamic that diminishes you, and that changes your internal state. You're no longer waiting to be chosen, you're choosing what you engage with. You're no longer hoping for better behavior, you're requiring it through your actions. And that level of self-alignment creates a presence that people feel. Because at the end of the day, respect is built on two pillars: clarity and consequence. Without consequence, clarity is just noise. Without action, words are just intentions. So you don't need to fight for respect. You don't need to convince anyone to treat you differently. You simply remove the reward for being treated the same. Because the moment your presence is no longer guaranteed in the face of disrespect is the moment your value becomes undeniable. Now, once you've removed the reward for disrespect and aligned your actions with your standards, you're ready to move forward. There's another layer that determines whether all of it holds or quietly collapses under pressure. And that layer is your emotional composure, especially in the moments where they withdraw. Because anyone can be grounded when things are going well. Anyone can speak clearly when the other person is responsive, engaged, and present. But the real test comes when that presence disappears, when the messages slow down, when the energy shifts, when you feel that familiar distance creeping in. That's the moment where most people lose their center. And it's not because they lack intelligence or awareness. It's because withdrawal triggers something deeper. It activates uncertainty. And uncertainty, if you're not conscious of it, quickly turns into anxiety. The mind starts filling in gaps. Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest? Should I say something? Should I fix this? And before you realize it, you're no longer responding, you're reacting. Now, here's what you need to understand. An avoidance withdrawal is not always a statement about you. It's often a pattern within them, a rhythm they've developed to regulate their own internal state. But when you react emotionally to that pattern, you unintentionally make it about you. You step into their cycle, and now both of you are reinforcing it. They withdraw, you react. They feel pressure. They withdraw further. That loop continues until someone breaks it. And the only person you have control over is you. So emotional composure is not about suppressing what you feel. It's about not allowing what you feel to dictate what you do. It's the ability to experience the discomfort of distance without immediately trying to eliminate it. When you say, I'm here when you're ready to communicate respectfully, and you actually mean it, you're doing something powerful. You're not chasing them into their withdrawal, and you're not shutting down in response. You're holding your position open, but not overextended. That's a very different energy. Because now, instead of you adapting to their inconsistency, they're confronted with your consistency. And consistency, especially when it's calm and unreactive, has a stabilizing effect on the dynamic. It removes the volatility. It removes the emotional spikes that often push avoidance further away. But more importantly, it shifts the responsibility. You're no longer managing the connection for both of you. You're no longer compensating for their distance with extra effort. You're allowing them to meet you or not. And in that space, their behavior becomes more visible even to themselves. Now, let's be clear, this is not easy. Staying composed when you feel uncertain requires discipline. It requires self-trust. It requires you to sit with questions that don't have immediate answers. And most people avoid that discomfort by taking action, sending another message, seeking reassurance, trying to regain control. But control in this context is an illusion. The more you try to control the connection, the more you lose control of yourself. And that's the trade-off you can't afford. Because the moment you lose your emotional center, everything else we've talked about, boundaries, self-worth, consequences, starts to weaken. Not because they're wrong, but because they're no longer being delivered from a place of strength. Avoidants don't respond to pressure, but they do respond to stability. They notice when someone doesn't escalate. They notice when someone doesn't chase. And over time, that stability becomes something they can actually engage with rather than escape from. So when they pull back, you don't follow, you don't panic, you don't overanalyze, you remain grounded, clear, unmoved. Because in the end, the person who holds their composure in moments of uncertainty is the person who holds the power in the dynamic. And once you've reached this point where you're grounded in your self-worth, clear in your boundaries, disciplined in your reactions, then you're ready to move forward. And no longer rewarding what diminishes you, everything now comes down to one final principle: consistency. Because consistency is what transforms all of this from an idea into an identity. Anyone can say the right words once. Anyone can hold a boundary for a moment. Anyone can stay composed when they're prepared. But what defines how people treat you is not what you do occasionally, it's what you do repeatedly, especially when it's inconvenient. Avoidants, more than most, pay attention to patterns. They may not analyze them out loud, but they register them over time. They notice what changes and what stays the same. And if your standards fluctuate, if you're strong one day and accommodating the next, if you pull back but then return quickly, without change, the signal becomes unclear. And when the signal is unclear, the behavior doesn't change. This is why consistency is so powerful. It removes ambiguity. It creates a stable framework that the other person can't misinterpret. When you respond the same way to the same behavior calmly, clearly, without emotional spikes, you establish a pattern that becomes predictable. And predictability in this context builds respect, not because it's controlling, but because it's reliable. It tells the other person, this is who I am. This is how I operate. This is what you can expect if you engage with me. There's no guessing, no mixed signals, no emotional volatility. And that kind of presence is rare. Now here's the deeper layer. Consistency is not just about how they experience you, it's about how you experience yourself. Every time you uphold your standard, even when it's uncomfortable, you reinforce your own self-trust. You prove to yourself that your words mean something, that your boundaries are not conditional, that your value is not something you negotiate under pressure, and that internal alignment changes the way you show up. You stop second guessing. You stop over explaining. You stop seeking validation for decisions you already know are right. There's a quiet certainty that begins to replace the noise, and people feel that. Avoidants, in particular, respond to that kind of energy because it doesn't threaten their autonomy, it mirrors it. They are used to controlling their environment, their pace, their level of engagement. But when they encounter someone who is equally self-directed, who isn't trying to control them, but also isn't yielding themselves, something shifts. There's a mutual respect that begins to form, not based on emotional intensity, but on psychological alignment. But this only happens if your consistency is real. If you hold your standard for a week and then abandon it the moment you feel them slipping away, the entire structure resets. Not because they're manipulating you, but because the pattern you've shown them is that your boundaries are negotiable under pressure. And once something is perceived as negotiable, it rarely gets taken seriously. So the discipline here is long-term. It's not about immediate results, it's about sustained identity. You're not trying to change them overnight. You're becoming someone whose presence requires a certain level of respect to be maintained. And over time, that becomes the only way they know how to engage with you, because you've shown them again and again that anything less simply doesn't work. And here's the paradox. The more consistent you are, the less you have to assert yourself, the less you have to explain, to remind, to correct. Your behavior speaks before your words ever need to. You become self-evident. And in that state, respect is no longer something you ask for, it's something that naturally organizes itself around you. Because in the end, people don't rise to your expectations, they rise to your consistency. And the moment your standards stop changing is the moment their behavior finally does. So when you step back and look at all of this together, a pattern becomes clear, and it's not about them, it's about you. It's about who you are when space is created. It's about how you speak when things feel uncertain. It's about what you allow, what you reinforce, and what you quietly walk away from. Because at no point in this process are you forcing an avoidant to respect you. You're not convincing them, chasing them, or emotionally negotiating your worth. You are doing something far more powerful. You are becoming someone whose presence operates on a different standard. You respect their space, but you don't abandon yourself. You set boundaries, but you don't flood them with emotion. You speak from self-worth, not fear. You remove the reward for inconsistency. You stay composed when they withdraw. And most importantly, you do it consistently, not occasionally. And when all of that aligns, something shifts at a level deeper than words. The dynamic reorganizes. The roles change. You're no longer the one seeking clarity, you become the one defining it. You're no longer reacting to their behavior, you're setting the tone that their behavior must meet. That's when respect shows up. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence made anything less unsustainable. And here's the truth most people miss. This isn't just about dealing with an avoidant. This is about the standard you bring into every relationship, every interaction, every connection in your life. Because the way people treat you is not random. It's shaped subtly, consistently by what you tolerate, what you reinforce, and who you are when it matters most. So you don't need the perfect words. You don't need the perfect timing. You just need alignment between what you believe you deserve and how you actually show up. Because in the end, the moment you fully embody your value is the moment no one can engage with you without respecting it.